Viewer content warning. The information in this video contains topics such as mental, physical, and sexual abuses. Therefore, viewer discretion is advised. Therapies for a Better Me series, written and hosted by child abuse survivor and advocate coach Lisa L. Baudouin. Copyright 2021 by Lisa L. Baudouin, all rights reserved. Source disclosure. While Lisa has copyright ownership of her theories, analogies, and most therapies that she presents, Lisa is not the owner of the sourced information that is sometimes used in her presentations. But in all cases, Lisa is grateful and gives attribution due. Please note, if you would like to use the source material, you must contact the sources directly to make such requests. Hello, my name is Lisa Baudouin, and welcome to Lisa's chat room. Before we go any further, please understand that I'm not the doctor or the counselor or the therapist. I'm the patient. I'm the person on the opposite side of that desk. I'm merely sharing information as a patient, which means I can only answer basic questions or suggestions about these videos and my own take on what's going on with me. So now on with the presentation, Therapies for a Better Me 102, which is my suggestion for you to create your own parenting playbook, especially if you're going to have children or you have children. But before we get into the actual playbook itself, I want to give you a backstory of how this came to be, at least my thinking on this. And now we've already talked about the process I use to process everything, which is wiggling the thumb, where I contain that information, which is in my therapy playbook. But what happened was, as I was researching all this information, I came up with a theory on what I call the dynamics of abuse. I had been researching other information and it's like an epiphany. It just came to me. So what I first did was I created a website and I put the dynamics of abuse on one web page, and then another web page had changing direction. And that was basically the analogies and the therapies that I'd come up with so far. But surprisingly, what happened was people started contacting me and they just started asking me questions. So I would sometimes meet with these people, except I have you sign a waiver. I'm not an expert in anything. I'm just merely sharing information, kind of like chatting and saying, here's what happened to me and here's the theories I have. Remember, I was talking about my hands being tied back. I believe that when you are suffering from a really bad experience, that your autonomic processes start to play. Now, I know there's all kinds of medical analogies and terminology out there, but this is my own take on how I perceive it. Basically, I look at anatomical structure, and we have all kinds of filtering systems for the physical part of us. And there's many different ways to keep out toxins. And then when toxins get in the body, there's many ways for those toxins to be removed. One of them is through the digestive system. And it is so awesome to actually research this information because you become aware at just how unique and beautiful you are to that autonomic process of you. It is constantly regulating and making sure that you are getting just nutrients, and then it's flushing out all these toxins. And what it can't flush out, what it will do is it will store it in fatty tissue. And the thing is when you are eating a lot of toxic foods, well, then what happens is it just keeps storing up. And the reason it slowly releases is because body knows how much toxins can be in the body. And then it's a slow process, because if you release too much toxin into your blood or your body, you can get what they call toxic overload. So we'll talk about that again, another video. But basically, that is the physical process of just one of the ways we filter. And I believe that the mental self mirrors the physical self. And so I believe what happens is if you are being abused, and especially dependent upon your age, dependent upon your faculty, depending upon who's violating you, depending upon your beliefs at the time, what will happen is the autonomic self will say, okay, we're going to store this away until such time that she can process this information. And so then what will happen is, first of all, the abuse has to stop. Otherwise, the autonomic system says, I'm not letting go of this stuff. And what is that? It's pushing the hands back behind your back. Once the abuse stops, then what will happen is the higher sense of self will say, okay, she's ready to start releasing some of this trauma wall. In other words, the hands are going to start to come forward. The thing is, though, that even though the hands are coming forward, there's painful experiences that yet to be processed, but there's other stuff in there too. First of all, there's the dogma of the day. There's the beliefs of whatever you believed during this time of abuse. And then there's the belief of the violator. And that's where the dynamics of abuse shows you that this violator will take a delusion and groom you prior to abuse and then ground it during the abuse. And it's their verbal and their physical actions that do this. So remember, I told you I was in my 30s and my sister called me. And what happened was my hands just came really quickly in front of me. And I went like this and questioned it and said, wait, that's not what happened at all. That whole wiggling the thumb is the process of identifying and translating to your higher sense of self that you are ready. So as I look back on my life, hands are pushed back. Eventually, through time, once the abuse had stopped, the hands were coming forward. But the problem was I didn't know the process, didn't understand the process, had no one to help me with this process. And I had constant issues because of my mental storms and the societal storms and relational storms that were going on. So it's constantly being like this and coming forward and then going back and coming forward and going back. So now, once I created the dynamics of abuse, I understood all this. Again, I believe that what happens is I have mental storms, but there's acuteness that is going on in other things. Like a person who's blind ends up having an awareness of their other senses. So it's the same thing. I just can actually see abuse. And so I created this Dynamics of Abuse webpage and this Changing Direction webpage, and people started contacting me. Now, most of the people who contacted me were older, right around, I would say, at least 40, maybe 45. Some much, much older. And it was really amazing how I connected with those people and they connected with me. It was like I was a mirror of them and they were a mirror of me. But the thing is that I've come through these processes, put the analogies in place so I have something to grasp onto. So I have something to understand. It's like trying to do math without understanding it or anything. You just can't. You have to understand the principles of it, the pattern structures of it. So I would talk to these people and I talked to them one-on-one, free of charge. And I loved it. It felt really great because I felt like I was helping people. And in a way, I can see where they are mentally with the traumatic walls. Are the hands completely behind their backs or are they coming forward? And most of the time they were to the point where they were ready to hear what I had to say. And I think oftentimes you'll find my website because you're ready now. If you're a survivor, you're ready now to hear it. And my agenda here is to help people that are ready, but also to remember, I was in my 30s and I was looking for books and I couldn't find anything. And I really wanted to be able to understand things. So I'm also hoping that I can reach out to those people too, who maybe are not ready yet, but the information that I give to them will help them, but in the years to come. When you look at the dynamics of abuse, what will happen is you'll kind of come forward. You'll start to get the awareness. And then when you actually get to the dynamics of abuse, the actual dynamics and the variables, and you start thinking about this, start applying it and putting situations into this model of abuse, then you start to bring forward any kind of traumatic experiences you've had. And then you kind of question them. And then you got to wiggle the thumb. And there's more to it than just a memory. It's bringing it forward. It's remembering it. But then it's processing it and saying, okay, how do I feel about that now? What was the dogma of the day? What was my mentality, purity? And then what did the violator impress upon me? And when you're doing all this, what's happening is it is a translation for the autonomic processes that's saying, okay, she's ready. She's ready to release this. She's ready to translate the pain. And so I also translate the pain in a much different way than most people. And the whole process, to me, the whole process of not the experience, the very painful experience. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the process of my autonomic systems, the unseen part of me protecting me like that, to me, is beautiful. It's amazing. It changed my mindset about who I am. about that connection of who I am. And it really did. It just made a complete difference in myself. And I will go into more videos and whatnot, and I'll give you all kinds of analogies and therapies on this. But just coming to that reasoning, wow, my autonomic processes really care about me. And it is me. It's not a split part of me. It's all integrated. My physicality, things that are going on, my skin, that's me. The digestive system, that's me. My mental brain, my mental processes, that's me. So anyway, I would share this with people and I was very excited. And surprisingly, I had so many people opening up just so quickly and telling me their experiences. And honestly, I did see a pattern. Constantly seeing a pattern with survivors and also violators. For example, in incest, the violator will violate a child from 4 to 12, about that age. I would love to get involved in something I'm going to be talking about in a minute called NCANS, where it's statistical study and really hone in on this type of information and take my dynamics and apply it to NCANS. On the violator side, we're getting information about the victim. I want to get information about the violator, because if we can get information about the violator, guess what? We can stop violation. See, the thing is people will call violators monsters, but what it really is people who are doing monstrous acts. It's a horrible thing that they're doing. But they were little babies at one point and they grew up. There's where the variables come into play. And we'll talk about that later. But so I was really getting in tune with all this and I was connecting to people and you wouldn't believe. And I felt like they were ready to talk. Remember in my 30s, I wanted someone to be there. There was no one there. I'm here now. And they were just ready to talk. And again, I'm not a medical expert, but I am an expert on being a survivor. I have so much experience and understanding it. That's really what I think has gravitated people towards me and me towards them. So the very first person I talked to about this was a woman that I was telling her about my new book. I had written a book called Layers, and it was actually just a short novelette. And again, it was a semi-fictional story. It was a slightly different take. And actually, I think it's an amazing story too. And I did try to sell it. Now, this time I tried to upload it and sell it. It didn't work, but I was telling her about it at the time and she just opened up, boom, and said, you know what? I was incested by my grandfather. The average person that talks to me is usually right between, I would say 45 and 65. That's the age. The thing is that memory is there. Like I said, there's more to it than that. Just because you remember it doesn't mean you have translated it. So during this, I would meet people one-on-one, again, like I said, and I got a phone call from a person that lived up north. Now, I'm not going to tell you who they were or their gender, but I will tell you that they were in their late 20s. Pretty sure they weren't even 30 yet. So I was really actually surprised that this person connected with me because oftentimes their hands are tied behind their back. And their story was that they had been repeatedly incested by their uncle from the time they were about 4 years old until they were about 11 years old. And so I literally drove to where they lived, met them in a restaurant. And the thing is that I do most of the listening at that point. I do talking at the end, but I'm actually listening. And I'm listening for certain things that they're going to tell me. First, they tell me their story. They tell me what's going on with them, which really is just so nice for them to be able to talk to somebody that has been there and has gone through this. And then I start to ask them specific questions, because the thing about it is your hands are going to be held back if you're taking substances too. The process is going to hold you back, the traumatic process. But if you're on substances of any kind, that's actually holding you back from processing. And I know this because I was on the worst of the worst drugs. I shot up meth, I shot up speed, I drank, I smoked, and I smoked cigarettes, and cigarette smoking actually held it back a long time. I quit smoking in 2004. That's when the hands started to come like this. Really, until that point, I really wasn't processing. Now, can you process if you smoke? I don't know. I didn't. I couldn't. I would assume too that this is all types of substances that will cause this to happen. to you, especially when they're addictive substances, when you're on some type of addictive materials. So I will ask questions about that after someone's told me their story. Are you on any kind of substances? Are you on any medications? And I'm not saying that you can't think these through, but it's going to help me to understand and assess where you are. So, but eventually the point is to have you figure out where you are. You sit there and think about it and think, okay, where am I here? And you can do that based on your behavior and what you're taking and what you're doing and what you're saying and the relationships you're having and things like that. So eventually I'm going to show you how to do this yourself. And I'm not a doctor. Don't get me wrong. It's not about that. It's about looking at this person and saying, well, where are they in comparison to me? And what can I share with them that's going to help them where they are right now? There's certain things that maybe someone's already come to understand. So I'm not going to sit there and spend time doing that because it's a lot of information. Everything I give is kind of like a one-time thing where I'm sitting there, I give you this information, and then I leave, and that's it. So I'm listening to this person, and here I'll ask you questions about, do you have a wife, a husband? Is something going on in your life? How many sisters do you have? How many brothers? Were you ever bullied as a child? What I'm doing is I'm getting a picture. And I usually know exactly where to start with my spiel, with, what I'm going to say. I go through all the points, but I kind of go through the first 10 or so pretty quickly. And then I go through some a little bit more in depth. So for this person, this is different because they're doing this, but there's so much more for them to comprehend. And so I sat there for some time and I went over the dynamics of abuse. And again, what that does is it does this. And it shows you that it wasn't personal as it is to you. It wasn't personal to the violator. That violator, it's all about them. It was never about me, never. With my parents, in all the violations that I've looked at and studied and researched, it's never been about the victim. It's the violator's delusional thoughts. So with that dynamics of abuse, it kind of shows that. It shows where you are in the abusive roles. It shows the dynamics that are taking place. And then I showed them the changing direction. And I went through, and these are just printouts. And I went through the bullet points. And then I left. And the thing is one of the rules I do is I don't contact that person again, ever. If they want to reach out to me again, fine. But I don't contact them because I've already given them what I can give them. I can't give them any more. Everything I know, and the whole point is, okay, I'm just one dot. Remember, I'm one dot of advocacy. Then there's lots of other dots of advocacy that you have to go out and do. And I talk about that in the Changing Direction. So I left, and then I had to drive home, and it was a long drive. And I started to worry. I started to rethink things. And I would say to myself, oh my gosh, what about this? Did I mention this? Was I really giving them all the information that I had? And then I'm like, oh, wait, I thought about something else. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot about this. So it got to the point where I was literally sick to my stomach by the time I got home because I started worrying, did I give that person everything I could possibly give them? And the thing is, remember, when I was in my 30s, I was looking for this information and I didn't find it. And because of that, I struggled and struggled and struggled. Where if I can give this information to someone, now that person might not use it that day, that year, but in 10 years' time, they will probably remember and they'll say, oh yeah, okay, I get it now. And so I was literally sick to my stomach for a couple weeks because, I don't get any money. I don't want any money. You want to buy my books or make a movie out of them? Okay. But otherwise, I want people to pay for this information. And that's why I copyright it so that other people can't take it and steal it and try to pay for it. This should be given freely to everyone. So what I decided at that point was I'm just going to make a presentational series. And actually at the time, it was just going to be one video. But what happened was it would have been a really long video. I mean, the video would have been about, 5 hours long. And I'm like, oh, I can't do that. So I'm going to bring you to this slide. This is the Dynamics of Abuse presentational series, and it was an outline. And I had 1, 3, 5, and 6. And 1 is about me, who is Lisa Baudouin. And then 3 was the Dynamics of Abuse. And then 5 and 6 were actually changing direction on one printout. And so what I did was in 5 and 6, I split it. But really now in hindsight, it's like, it doesn't matter because they go hand in hand. And then I needed to get more information about child abuse definitions and violator definitions, because I set up the abusive roles in the mindset of a survivor. And the dynamics of abuse is actually me, a survivor, looking at the potential impulse patterns of the mindset of a violator. That's what I'm doing. I'm looking at it from not a medical point of view, but from someone who was a victim and is now a survivor. So my terminology is slightly different than anyone in the medical or legal standpoint. So I wanted to look up definitions. And so I started doing some research, and I ended up finding this person here, Professor Johnny B. Myers. Professor Myers is renowned for his work. He's been doing this for many, many years. He's an advocate. He's an attorney. He's in brochures, he's in books, he's in pamphlets, he's in presentations. I actually contacted him and asked him, could I use your information? And Professor Myers was kind enough to allow me. So thank you very much, Professor Myers. It really made a difference. And just having that connection. Remember, I was telling you about the story that I wrote in the last video about how I pictured Harrison Ford. Well, you know what? It wasn't very amazing. I pictured Harrison Ford and Professor Myers as one character. I mean, and it was weird because I didn't know about Professor Myers at that time. So that's the person that would be in my book. And actually, this man has done that. He is an advocate against child abuse. So all this information about child abuse history too is based on his information. Just want to get clear. The 2 key pieces of information that I used was an article that he wrote, A Short History of Child Protection in America, and also a YouTube presentation, PSU Child Sexual Abuse Conference, Johnny B. Myers. And so he talks about the child abuse description came from 3 eras in the United States. Now we're going to be talking about the United States here. So if you're from another country, after this video, shut it off and go do some research about your own laws and your own history on how you came to these laws. But Professor Myers talks that in the United States, there are basically 3 eras that led us into getting a really good description about what child abuse is. And the first era was from colonial times to 1874, 1875-ish. And what that was basically was private concern and magistrate influence. And then the second era was from 1874, 1875 to 1961. And so what was happening, it's kind of snowballing. And now you've gotten societal advocacy along with government intervention. So juvenile courts took place, the Children's Bureau was created, the Social Security Act was created, all within this time, along with other things. I'm just kind of key pointing a few of these. The next era, the era we're in right now, started in 1962. And again, it just snowballed into more with the government intervention of creating what is called the CAPT. We're going to get into that in a minute, but Professor Myers said that within this era, there were many key people, and there were. And the whole point is there have been advocates all throughout history. There are pockets of them. There are people that come forward, and then eventually their advocacy ends because they get old and they need to retire or something happens. But there's always been these advocates that come out and help. That's the whole point of me. I'm an advocate. And eventually I'll be done. And my goal is to make it where these presentations are there forever and they move forward, even if I'm not anymore. Anyway, Professor Myers talks about all the key people, and he talks about how there was resistance in this pushing, this movement. And 2 of the key people that were involved in that, the first one was a doctor named C. Henry Kemp, and he was the co-author of The Battered Child Syndrome, which was published in 1962, the year I was born. And what did it do? It created this awareness. And then there was another gentleman, and his name was Vincent DeFrancis, and he wrote books on the subject, and one of them was Child Abuse and Nationwide Survey by Vincent DeFrancis, director. So Vincent DeFrancis wrote a lot of books, and in his career, he did a lot of surveys and a lot of statistical data because he was really concerned, not just what was happening to that child during and right after the abuse, but the repercussions of the child abuse in the years to come for that person, like me. So Vincent DeFrancis, he was right up my alley because in my career, first of all, when I was in the group home, I ended up becoming involved in a couple of programs through the state. Now, I was abandoned to the state. I was a ward of the state. They were my guardians. And I actually had a guardian ad litem, and I had social workers, and I would have to go to court every once in a while, and they would oversee me. And during that time, I was asked if I wanted to go into some employment programs, and I did. One was called the National Youth Corporation, and another was called Vocational Exploration Program. Basically, they were out of a group of different types of employers, and you would pick one of them. Usually what would happen is offices have many departments. So you would end up going into one department and then the next department and then the next department over the next 8 or 9 weeks through the summer. And so I remember one time I decided to work at a bank. And so the first week I was in the proof and transit department, and then the next week I was in the loan department. When I turned 18, I went to work for a factory, and the first 7 years I worked in the factory. And after working in several departments, I became a floater. And what a floater is someone who actually jumps into a job when someone's sick or they're on vacation. And I would jump into jobs. Again, getting this real big visualization of how production works. All the departments entwined and what each job is, how it comes to make a product. Then after that, I went to the office and I was the receptionist switchboard operator. And I handled over a 300-line switchboard. There were thousands of calls every month that came in. And it took time. Don't think it just happened overnight. But I ended up knowing all the departments, who worked where in every single department because I had to. It was part of the job. If somebody called and they needed someone, I had cheat sheets in front of me and whatnot. But eventually I got to the point where I just knew it. Again, seeing everything out there. After that, I ended up trying to get into sales, and that didn't work so well. I became a medical assistant, went to school for that. I went to college, and a medical assistant's basically a person who works in a doctor's office. So I did that for a while, but it didn't pay like I thought it would. Now, this is in the 90s, and I really had wanted to be a nurse at St. Jude's. That was my goal, to work with terminal children, and it didn't work out. I really wish it would have because I love kids. So anyway, I ended up going back into the administrative area. I became a temp, and I started jumping into positions, and sometimes they were for a day and sometimes for a week, sometimes for a year. So I was going in and out of jobs, which was terribly difficult at times, but it wasn't, because my mental processes were breaking down, and there was nothing more disappointing than people seeing it. And by jumping in and out of jobs, people didn't see it as much. If I was there and I stayed there, you'd be able to really see the breakdown of my mind. I couldn't focus and keep and hold that information. However, computers could. That's why I really liked computers. And I even had an Apple IIe when my kids were little. First program was to create an algorithmic math program in Integer Basic. I'm what I call a grandma database programmer. Keep it simple. Not stupid, just keep it simple. I don't like the word stupid, but I do everything very basically. Don't have extensive training. I actually read the books. I created a database because I hand paint glass, and I had a little hobby business going on. So I created this database and I just read the books. If you read the book on a program, you can learn so much. So anyway, I loved computers because they're what you call data containment. So then I wouldn't have to remember. All I'd have to remember are the patterns, the rules, the menus, and things like that. And then the variables, the stuff that I was putting in them, I didn't have to remember that because that was the most difficult to remember. So I do go into the second video and talk about statistical data and how we collect it and whatnot. But I'm going to talk here a little bit about how data is collected in a database. And the reason I'm doing this is because maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but I want you to see where I'm coming from. So basically a database, at least 2 tables, if not more, usually lots more, that are connected together. And they're usually connected through special numbers. They're usually auto numbers. So you've got a table. And if you've ever used Microsoft Excel, or if you've used Lotus 123, I think I used to use, and Google Sheets, you will be familiar with this. And that is basically a table. You can make the table function and put calculations in the table if you want to, but columns of the table, and they're called fields, are the patterns. And the rows of the tables are called records, and those are the variables. So if you're looking at the diagram that I have out here on the screen, this is an example of two tables that are hooked together. So let's say I end up going to the store, and I went in the store March 26th. And now maybe this store has a bunch of other stores to it. So I go to the store, but I happen to go to store one. I don't know that, but that's store one. And I go and I buy some milk, and I buy some bread, and I buy some eggs, and then I come home. So what's happened is, in the customer order table, you have one record, but in the customer order details table, you have many records. So you're looking at what they call a one-to-many relationship. And what's connecting these records together, the detail records with the customer order table, is that order ID. And in this example, it's called a COID, customer order ID. We're just pretending here that it's the first record in that customer order table. And so then in the order details table, you can see the customer order ID is 1. And then each detail has its own ID as well. So say the next day I forgot stuff. So the next day I go back and I buy some vanilla, and I buy some flour and some laundry soap. And so now what's happened is, in the customer order table, we have another record. And then in the details table, those details are split out. So what has happened now, though, the store is still number 1. I still went to the same store in the customer order table, but in the details table, what has happened is it's customer order ID number 2 all the way down, and then the item ID for those details. Again, if you're looking at it, then you can definitely see that the columns, which are the fields, there's a set pattern, but the records which go across, these are the variables. Each record has variables within that field. And this is really important for you to understand moving forward. But this was what Vincent DeFrancis was all about. He was about doing surveys and statistical data and seeing, and I call this mapping, because eventually you can get a picture in your mind of what's going on. Just like I talked in number 2 in the dynamics of abuse, how it can take polls, surveys for everything. And then you can get an idea of where something is or isn't. And then you make strategies, and then you can change it. And so from there, Professor Myers starts to talk about the CAPT. So basically what's happened is, this definition came from all this history, not just some people, it's from everybody. It's been shaped and formed. And this public law gives us the exact definition of what child abuse is. So it was signed by President Nixon in 1974. And then what I did was, if I wanted to go see the law itself, I knew nothing of the laws. I knew nothing of government, not really. I knew there was a capital, the president, vice president, chiefs of staff, but I didn't understand any of it. Remember, I missed school. So I literally had to go back out and study government. I go all the way back. I have some massive files where I went and researched and just came forward. How did we come to have a government like we do? So I went out and I found the actual verbiage of the act, and it says, for purposes of this act, the term child abuse and neglect means the physical or mental injury, sexual abuse, negligent treatment, or maltreatment of a child under the age of 18 by a person who is responsible for the child's welfare under circumstances which indicate that the child's health or welfare is harmed or threatened thereby, as determined in accordance with regulations prescribed by the Secretary. So that is the definition of child abuse. And this definition is now been amended and addended. It'll actually expand or broaden or even articulate a little bit more on its definition due to the statistical study that's constantly being done, the study of the child abuse. This is where I decided to take this presentation and start talking about this and then lead into a parenting playbook. This is my suggestion, is to take and do the wiggling the thumb. And what is this? You're now seeing that this is a pattern, and anything that you're doing is the variable of this pattern. So we're going to talk about these suggestions. Focusing on both hands would be looking at child abuse history and definitions, looking at government agencies, looking at advocates throughout the centuries, throughout the history, and then you focus your right hand and you would look at statistics, reporting tools, expert opinion, educators on raising children, and other advocacies. So that's where we're at right now. So I just want to take a moment on that, and I want to talk about some of the key reports that I found. For me, this is kind of a template, and I invite you to stop the video and write this stuff down in your playbook if you have it, or on a sheet of paper, whatever you want, or when you finally get it, come back to this video and watch this and use this as a template for your parenting playbook. This is the outline of it. And so the research reports, now there are hundreds of reports and statistical data being done today on all different topics of child abuse in different situations and looking at it. So the ones that I look at mostly are the child maltreatment reports and the AFCARS report that come out of the Children's Bureau, and then the governmental departments, and then the ACE studies that come from the CDC. So I make sure I really focus in on them, but I look at other ones too. So I'm just going to introduce you to these three reports. We're not going to get into the statistical information. And in fact, that's what I'm inviting you to do, to look at these reports and you get into the statistical information and maybe jot it down. This is all on the internet. It's all free. There's a link below in the description. This child maltreatment report is coming from the Department of Health and Human Services. And now the thing I want to say about it is, first of all, when you open up this report, it's a PDF file. So the page number of the report is not going to be the same as the page number at the top of the PDF screen. So I'm going to be referring to the top of the PDF screen, not the page of the report. So on page 4, you see a report type. Now, to me, give or take, there's 3 different ways that they're reporting in here. And the first one is summation. So this is an example of the summation where they are doing a narrative and they're bringing in summary key points, bullet points, and then giving you the actual numbers and at times the percentage in rise from the last year or in decline from the last year. The next type of reporting is the exhibits. They can be detailed out a little bit or they can be congregated together. So maybe something by year and they're showing you many different years, or maybe they're showing you maltreatment types and condensing that information. And then the other reporting are tables. And tables are basically the same as the exhibits, except they're detailed out. They've got more information. So my suggestion when you first open this up is to go through the table of contents and familiarize yourself with these 3 different ways that they are reporting, and then just look them over. And then go through the whole report and then come back to it and just hone in and focus on certain things. And one of the things you'll probably want to look at is the statistics at a glance. Now, these maltreatment reports come out every year, as far as I know. I've got them from 2015 on to 2019. And these statistics at a glance are a really good tool because you can just see statistics at a glance. This information is basically coming from NCANS. The only other thing I'm going to mention on here is the maltreatment type reports, the tables that they have. What they're telling you in this report is that there may be more than one maltreatment type per victim. And so the first page actually goes into the numbers, splits it out by maltreatment type. And then the next page does the same thing, only percentages. And then the next page actually kind of turns it a little bit, showing you a different glimpse of this. And then again, the following page of that is a percentage. So the other report that I recommend to take a look at is the AFCARS report, and this is the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. And it's basically telling you what it is. It's all the adoption and foster care analysis that have gone on for 2019, but I like this report because it actually gives you statistical data for previous years. This report and the maltreatment report that I talked about comes from the Children's Bureau, but it also comes from some other government agencies. They're all working together to provide these reports. So make sure you check out their websites and look at their information. The final report that I wanted to talk about here is the ACE study. Now, the ACE study is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And this study, what it does is it is looking for repercussions of child abuse in survivors. what has happened to them physically and mentally in their lifetime. So the last thing I want to touch base on, I'm actually going back to the Children's Bureau's maltreatment report. And you can find this also in the Children's Welfare Information Gateway website too. And that's a really great resource as well. I just want to bring you back to this summation that they have, because if you read the final bullet point here that I've got on the screen, it says for the fiscal of 2019, a national estimate of 1,840 children died from abuse and neglect at a rate of 2.5 per 100,000 children in the population. Now I've got the outline on the screen for you. Please go ahead and stop the video and write this down so that you can take some time and create a really good parenting playbook. And bringing that focus, bringing that awareness by doing the research on abuse history and definitions, and then coming up to child development and understanding the repercussions of abuse, the AIDS studies, that's part of it. Then finally, once you get to the point of understanding the CAFTA Act, not just a legal definition. It's based on what happens to a child after they've been abused. And I am living proof of that. And so are a lot of people. And that's the whole point of this. So my suggestion is to create your own parenting playbook and know this information, because the thing is even though it is a legal definition, it's what not to do. So then you can put in place alternative disciplines and direction for you to take to raise your child. Now, I'm not trying to tell you how to raise your child. That's not the point. The point is actually taking a harness of it and saying, I'll make my own parenting playbook. I'm going to research all this information and I'm going to have a plan, and then executing that plan. So some of the questions would be when, how, what will I teach my child? And I've got a bunch of stuff there that you can look at. Think your own questions on this. What do you envision teaching your child? And when? That's another important facet of it. So how do you find out the mental capacity of a child as they're growing? Go out and research it. Find out. One of the topics that a lot of people reach out to me for is what kind of disciplines should I put in place? There are many different alternatives in discipline now, and I'm not going to get into the arguments of discipline. I'm really leaving it for you to think about. What do you want to do? And go research what you want as far as how old they are, what they're doing. How am I going to deal with the financial issues? How much does it cost to raise a child? What am I going to do when I'm stressed out? How am I going to decompress so I don't get upset? And then finally, the last question is, how am I going to approach my child and talk about violators and the potential of getting abused and the dynamics and everything like that? I personally feel that if you don't have that conversation with your child, it's sort of like sending them out into a forest for the week with a backpack on, with not much tools or information to be able to foresee any issues. And of course, it's dependent upon the age of the child. So I always offer, why don't you talk to them at the maturity level that you need to talk to them to, but tell them about me. And just say, hey, I've watched this woman on the internet. She got hurt by her parents. And so we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about this and have a really good discussion about this. And even involve them in this playbook. What do they think? Maybe your child is 12 years old and you can say, well, what should be your punishment if you skip school? And maybe even they could do some research and find out information so that they are aware that they are doing this. And then finally, the evaluation plan. When you put a plan in place, the thing is, this plan is always going to be moving. Nothing can be set in stone. Some disciplines aren't going to work the way you think they're going to work. And you're going to have to ask yourself, well, what can I do so I don't stress out because of this or this or this, or my child's doing this, or tried this discipline, this doesn't work. What can I do now? Go out and research that now so you have it in this book, and then change it when you need to. Really, the idea of having your own parenting playbook is such a great plan, isn't it? It really is. And so make sure you get out there and get a 3-ring binder and get some loose leaf paper, get some colored pencils. You involve the kids and they get something nice on the side of the paper and really involve them into this process. And what's really, I think, very beneficial to this is that you can work with your partner and your family together in this playbook. You can bring everybody together and be on the same page, because that's really important when you're raising a child. So finally, use me as that example to broach the situation. So the next time we talk, we're going to be talking about the dynamics of abuse theory, the theory that I created, a survivor who's looking at the mindset impulse patterns of a violator. So until then, please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you again next time in Lisa's chat room.
That's it for this video. Thanks again for watching, and please like, subscribe, and share, and post a comment below. And as always, please stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll see you again next time here in Lisa's chat room.